Hi everyone, this is your host Alessia here for a quick announcement before we start with the episode. From now on, Voices of Italy episodes will be released every 2 weeks instead of every week. Turns out that producing, editing, and promoting a podcast as a one person team with zero budget takes quite a bit of time. Who knew? But I want each episode to bring you real stories and voices worth listening to, and to create a space where you can get to know the real Italy beyond the cliches and share your perspectives and experiences with me. This also takes me a lot of time, but you can support this little independent adventure, and it's both easy and free. Follow Voices of Italy on Spotify or Apple Podcast. Stay updated on Instagram or Blue Sky. And most importantly, if you've got feedback or ideas for future episodes, leave a comment, send a DM, or even a voice note. More Italian stories are coming, just a slightly more Italian pace. Now, back to the show. Ciao everyone, welcome to episode 23 of Voices of Italy. Today we're talking about calcio, aka soccer in Italian. For many Italians, calcio is, in their own words, an actual religion. They take it extremely seriously. They don't miss a game, just like a faithful Catholic doesn't miss the Sunday Mass. They are super loyal to their team and they will go nuts if you dare say anything even remotely negative about them. But I'm not here to tell you about the stereotypical Italian guy loudly rooting for his favorite team, or, as it is often referred to, his squadra del cuore. Because here at Voices of Italy, we look beyond the cliches and we deal with everyday, authentic Italy. Beyond the myth of calcio, there is actually a much complicated world strictly intertwined with mafia, neo fascism, toxic masculinity, maybe political power. A lot and lots of money. Stay tuned to find out why. Italy is one of the most iconic countries in the world. But what does Italy mean to the world? What does it mean to you?
Buongiorno.
Pizza.
Ciao Bella.
Michelangelo.
Spaghetti.
Mafia. Dolce Vita.
My name is Alessia, I'm Italian, and this is Voices of Italy, the podcast that peels back the layers of the Instagram perfect Italy to reveal everyday stories of authentic, surprising, and messy Italian life. An episode about calcio really wasn't part of the plan from the beginning. It sounded to me like a boring episode, to be honest, even though I know this is maybe not the most efficient way to make you want to listen the rest of this, but I do not follow calcio at all. And honestly, I never had any interest in learning anything about it. But just like that, recently it dawned on me. I actually have pretty hostile feelings about Italian soccer. And not because of the sport itself. I'm talking about realizing that I have negative feeling towards people who even like calcio sometimes. And please let me give you context here, because I'm not being a random sport hater. On the contrary, really. Thanks to my boyfriend, in the past few years, I've really learned to appreciate more the values of sport, the enjoyment of sharing passion for a sport with others, and to admire and respect the discipline, the hard work that athletes put into it to succeed. So here, that's really what I'm referring to, and what I'm going to tell you about is nearly not the discipline, the sport in itself. What I really don't like about calcio in Italy is everything that surrounds it here, or a big part of it. And I'm definitely not alone with this. I bet that you would normally think that all Italians like soccer. I had my own experience with foreigners during work or in other moments asking if I follow calcio, or even assuming I did, especially when they hear that I live here in Turin. For those who don't know, Turin is the base of Juventus, which is basically the biggest and most powerful football club in Italy. So even if you don't follow football, you might have heard the name here and there. But we'll come back to that a little bit later, because Juve is the perfect ambassador of the world of calcio in Italy that I want to describe to you today, for the good and for the bad sometimes. But let's take a little step back here and start with some cultural and historical background that we like a lot in Voices of Italy. We, meaning me, guys. This is all self produced. But Calcio is, in all actuality, the unrivaled, most popular sport in Italy. No doubts about that. Calcio literally means kick in Italian. And it's not a coincidence that it's the name that is only specifically used in Italy, while in other countries, usually it's referred to as soccer, football, or European football to distinguish it from the American football, of course. This is kind of unique to calcio and already gives you an idea because the language is really the most direct expression of cultural identity, we can say. Just to give you an idea of how many people I'm talking about, according to the results of the UEFA Growth Reputation Tracker survey, football in Italy involves 60% of the over 18 for a total of about 30 million people. And it's the most followed sport by both men, with 79% of men, and also women, even though that number drops to 41%. And according to another report from the Federazione Italiana Giuoco del Calcio, for 84% of the Italian population, football is a tradition and belongs to Italy's history as part of that tradition. So, to make a long story short, there is an incredibly important part of Italian identity today, especially for boys and men who are always the majority of the followers again. And they are sort of pushed towards culture from a very young age in Italy. Let's be honest, Italy doesn't have this vast sport culture in terms of what the most of the population does. That's what I'm referring to. So what that also means is that other sports in Italy don't get nearly the same amount of followers, attention, and investments, and in general of interest. It was a given for me when I was a kid that all the boys in my school liked calcio and were basically obsessed by it. They all had a favorite team. They had fiercely loyal to, and that was really like the topic that all the little boys at school were talking about, and they were collecting the little figurines with the football players. And as for girls, we honestly, I don't think Italian girls are that much encouraged to do any sport at all. And if anything, the only option most of the time for young girls is to do volleyball, which is called pallavolo in Italian. It is the only sport that I ever practiced at school, and I distinctly remember it being considered a girl's sport. Even by other kids, because the boys were always very disinterested, and or at least most of them. And on the other hand, girls were really not interested in culture most of the time, and if they were, maybe they were judged and mocked a little bit for being masculine. Those very nice things about youth that we all don't miss at all. But I want to say sport in general is something that unfortunately is not a big part of Italian children's life. And calcio is sometimes the only option for either lack of infrastructure and government support and resources. And despite that, even the smallest empty town in Italy will have a little soccer field as their one and only sport facility. I would say that Formula One and basketball are maybe the other two sports that you can maybe hear people actually liking and following and knowing something about in general, in terms of common knowledge and popularity. But again, nothing in comparison to calcio. And a funny personal story about this is that my boyfriend, he's a huge fan of MMA, and before meeting him, I had no clue what UFC was. I get really, I swear, never even heard of it. And I don't really know anyone that follows fighting sports, for example. And the only reference I had in my mind was wrestling, like not the discipline, the sport, like the TV wrestling with people, having their own wrestler identity and fighting for entertainment. That's the only reference that I had as a kid. And a bunch of kids actually like that. But I think in the minds of people is more entertainment than a sport. So I wouldn't really count it in this discourse. But as I was saying, my boyfriend, as an American guy in his early 30s, was the perfect person to convince me to watch MMA. And that's why I was referring to the fact that he really made me understand that passion for a sport, even a fighting, violent sport like that, can really just come from a place of, respect for the athletes, for their efforts, and that all that can come with that, just the sincere passion for a sport. But that's all it is, that it doesn't necessarily come with an obsession, in this case for violence. I have to admit that I had a little bit of a stereotype in my own mind about fighting sport that now I've completely demolished. And the reason why I'm telling you this is that when we first moved together here in Turin, one of the first things that really crashed my boyfriend's soul was that he was completely unable to find any pub or bar or any other place whatsoever where he could drink a beer and watch a UFC match, because no bars do that. Beyond the little time zone issue that most of the time is also a problem, but we were never able to find any place that would broadcast that in the first place, because there's almost every night at least one Calcio match, and all places, all bars, all pubs always give Calcio the priority. And really, if you want to watch anything else, it's going to be really difficult. And so that really made him sad at the beginning. Now we just gave up and watch stuff on YouTube. But I never thought about that. I've always found really normal that, of course, they broadcast Calcio. Of course, that's what people wanna see, But there's other sports out there, and it sounds really silly because that's an obvious statement, right? But really, for Italians, the attention towards sport is monopolized by Calcio. I've always been so immersed in this monopoly that I have to admit, not until long ago, assumed that Italy kind of invented calcio or in some way made it what it is today. And that's just not true. That's a totally wrong assumption if we refer to modern style soccer. But it is not totally wrong if we look at a longer historical perspective, because football actually started in England in the second half of the 1800s, and it didn't necessarily involve just feet. Hands were also used. And because other variants of the same game were played with hands, and became popular in countries like the US and Australia, then the word soccer started to be used just in the UK to indicate the variant where you use your feet. But it still was just football for the rest of the world. The reason why it became known as calcio in Italy, which again, it literally means kick, is tied to a much older tradition dating back to the 16th century. There was indeed a game practiced in Italy during those times. It was called Calcio Storico Fiorentino. You heard well, Fiorentino, so Florence. And it's still played in Florence every June during the celebrations of St. John the Baptist. And it actually doesn't look much like modern calcio. It's more of a mix of soccer, rugby, and a medieval street brawl. Because unlike calcio, almost anything is valid, almost anything goes. Punching, tackling, wrestling, head-butting, elbowing. However, the goal is basically to get the ball over the opponent's back wall without killing anyone. So sucker punches and kicks to the head are banned. So don't worry, they're not savages. What a relief, huh? I wouldn't want to be there anyway. But there's actually a legendary story about one specific game of Calcio Storico Fiorentino. In 1530, while the city of Florence was under siege from the Roman imperial army that wanted to restore the Medici family rule in the city, locals decided to play a full match of calcio storico right in the Piazza Santa Croce, so the local plaza, just to prove their enemies that life went on as usual and Florentines were not about to give up their traditions. That's pretty badass. I like Florence, so I'm probably a little biased. I've been there a million times. Want to go back a million times. It's really beautiful, but that's really pretty badass. And that's why this legendary battle inspired, let's say, the modern reenactments that they do every year in June. The match still takes place in Piazza Santa Croce, with sand covering the square to make it slightly less brutal. But even today, in Calcio Storico, almost anything goes. And there's a fun fact: the prize for winning the match isn't money, it's a cow. Yes, a real Chianina cow. The same kind used to make the famous bistecca alla Fiorentina, because in Florence, glory and steak go hand in hand. Okay, let's move forward. So, in a way, we indeed invented modern soccer, more or less, but all this didn't turn into the culture that we think of today until the 900s, when a fan basically suggested that the Italian word calcio was used instead of the foreign word, and sent a letter to the sport newspaper La Gazzetta dello Sport, to propose to call it calcio, just like the old Florentine sport. To be fair, it was really a general trend back then to sort of Italianize words, and even names of important historical figures were translated. Everything was translated, so it was really really more normal back then. And after that, the first Italian team started in Genova, in the region of Liguria. And at the beginning, Italian football developed almost exclusively in the north side of the country. The first actual national championship didn't happen until 1926. And it was by the will of the fascist regime that wanted to sort of unify the country through the sport. In hindsight, they succeeded, because to this day, crazy passion for calcio is indeed one of the few aspects that I think really in Italian culture you can see Italians from all over the country, from north to south, have in common, other than a love for food, of course. Finding out all the details of this little historical background was really probably one of the episodes so far that I found more inspirational and interesting on a personal level, because Voices of Italy and all of you listeners, as part of this podcast, have helped me rediscover and appreciate my Italian identity more. And I have to admit that I didn't know much of anything about the origins of culture before actually preparing for this episode. And doing that research definitely gave me some new appreciation for the tradition of the sport and its value in Italian history and culture. And so I think you must be now wondering if I'm bipolar or something, because I started the episode basically declaring hate for calcio and now I'm here praising it. But it's just a little bit different of the vibe of the modern version of calcio. My my whole life, I've actually disliked it, really. And over time, I started to have this mild prejudice towards people who call themselves calcio lovers. And I know how this sounds. So let me explain before I get labeled as some sort of sport bigot. As I was telling you, calcio in Italy is basically the one and only national sport. It's everywhere. You literally need to wait for the Olympic Games, maybe, to see anything sports related on TV and mainstream media that doesn't have to do with calcio. Of course, sport related. Occasionally, you hear of some other sports here and there, but that's pretty much it. Honestly, other sports and the way Italy succeeds in other disciplines is very much snubbed most of the time. We have, I think, recently both the Italian female and male volleyball team, for example, won the world championship. And it's incredible. Like, if you're someone that cares remotely about anything sport related, right? But I mean, if that was something that happened on the culture side of things, there would have been celebrations like the end of the world is approaching. And I'm not kidding. But it's not just the monotony of it that makes me dislike culture. So I'm not just saying boring, boring. I've seen already enough of it. But calcio in Italy is a big deal, really, to a lot of people. And how can I say, it leads sometimes to pure obsession in a lot of people. And as a teenager, it may sound silly, but my taste in boys was already very polarized when I was young, because if someone told me that they liked calcio a little bit too much according to my judgment, it probably lost completely my interest. So, and that excluded like 95% of the male population of my age group. So you can imagine how that technique went. It wasn't just personal taste, though. It was what I kept seeing all the time, because calcio fans just so often happen to show certain traits in certain contexts, and certain behaviors that pushed me away from taking an interest in the sport itself. So obviously that's wrong on me, because you really shouldn't judge someone for a sport that they like just because maybe there might be some negativity behind it in that environment. But let me explain a little better. You know how the word sportive is supposed to mean fair, respectful, graceful, whether you win or lose? Well, unfortunately, that definition is the complete opposite of the average culture fan's attitude that I have had experience with. I grew up thinking that it was completely normal for fans of rival teams to hate each other, to insult each other. And if most of the time, of course, that's just playful, it easily turns into something more than playful. When people think of Italian football, they picture maybe passion, stadiums roaring, scarves waving, entire cities shutting down on match day. But that's a little piece of that. That passion has, I have to say, a little bit of a darker side. Not everyone, of course. Again, don't make me say that. I have friends who love culture too. But there's an undeniable reality here that I want to bring to you. One mundane example. In a previous job, one of my closest colleagues in the office was this Sicilian guy that I really got along with amazingly on so many levels, but he was really obsessed with soccer. Hanging out with him outside work was nearly impossible, because if he wasn't watching a game, he was off playing calcetto, which is, by the way, just a basic five-a-side soccer squeezed into a smaller pitch. But anyway, he wouldn't miss that for anything. And sure, that's just a mild annoyance among friends, let's say, but it becomes a bigger problem when that obsession slips into a more aggressive and toxic behaviors. And unfortunately, those are quite common. I even wonder if it's connected to its brawl style origins that we were mentioning before, because it would explain a lot of that, to be honest. Riots and violent episodes at culture games are maybe not commonplace, but definitely not unheard of. And that aggressive spirit sips into private life as well. I have this picture so clear in my mind of, sometimes either family gatherings or nights with friends. And the slightly stereotypical scenario in this case is just a bunch of Italian men yelling at the TV, launching heavy insults at the other team, and, encouraging little kids to do the same. I'm really not talking about that cool, everybody's energized and we're watching the game. Like, really, I'm talking about heavy insults. And it will not shock you to hear that Italy has some infamous violent incidents that show just how extreme this kind of energy can get. And the result is this paradox, because Calcio is Italy's greatest unifier, really, but also a stage from some of its most divisive and toxic behavior in one way. And that's part of the reason why I never warmed up to it, because it's not just a sport. It really comes with a cultural baggage in a way that I personally don't feel super comfortable with. And I'm not alone in this, because just a few weeks ago, I was actually chatting with some friends. We were having lunch together, and we were talking about future and kids because we're all millennials at the table and we are in our 30s and all we talk about now is mortgages and back pain. And one of my friends at the table, she said while we were talking about kids that she would totally encourage her kid to practice any sport they're passionate about except calcio. I was a bit surprised because, again, that's a very, very neat position to take, but at the same time, I feel like I completely understood before she even explained why she was saying that. And she simply said that it's because she wouldn't want her kids to hang out with the kind of people that are obsessed with calcio. And at the table, it was basically this friend that made this statement, her boyfriend, and then it was me and my boyfriend. So obviously, the only clueless person there was my boyfriend. As an American, he was like, why? This seems a little bit too extreme. And that's when I realized, okay, yes, it only makes sense to us that this could be a position. And actually, another friend told me a similar thing recently that he loves calcio and he has a favorite team and everything, but he never really enjoys it fully, never goes to the stadium and watch a match, for example, because he feels like there's simply too much of what he calls an extremely aggressive environment. It's really this weird, sort of toxic sometimes attitude that people who are passionate about the sport have, not for their own fault. I think sometimes it's just really as humans we probably tend to normalize a lot anything that we see happening massively in our society. If a lot of people do something, we probably feel like it's totally okay to do the same, right? And it's not just that, guys, because I haven't even begun to talk about the worst side of calcio in Italy. So brace yourself. Sadly, calcio in Italy is also connected with organized crime, violent groups, political power plays, and a lot of corruption. Let's start with the so-called ultras, with the definition of what they are. A big part of this system. They are hardcore fans groups, but they are not just passionate fans waving flags at the stadium. They function almost like criminal groups, and they are known for their association with violence, crime, and far right extremism. Yay. For example, some groups have been tied with drug trafficking, extortion, and ticket scalping. In Naples, for example, in the past, prosecutors have linked certain ultras members directly to the Camorra, which is the Neapolitan local mafia. In Rome, some of the most infamous ultras had well documented ties with far right political movements using the curva, so the stands behind the goals, as recruiting grounds, basically. And this is not some of the underground system. As I was mentioning, those groups operate in plain sight and they have officially been linked to criminal activities. But why they are allowed to grow so powerful, often without strong control, you ask? Well, it's something Italians have been debating for decades, and it depends on several things. The first is political convenience. For years, governments, both local and national, have been accused of tolerating ultras to avoid widespread unrest. Stadiums are highly visible, and cracking down too hard could spark riots and spill into city streets. So, some politicians even tried to use ultras for their own influence, offering leniency or favors in exchange for peace in the stands. So, this certainly gives you a good idea. The second thing is club complicity. Many football clubs historically maintain a symbolic relationship with ultras teams. For example, Juventus Drughi and Curva Sud groups are accused of receiving discounted tickets or favorable treatment in exchange for supporting the team vocally and creating atmosphere in the stadium. But later investigations, like the trial called Alto Piemonte, revealed how these relationships slipped into outright criminal collaboration, including ticket scalping and intimidation. So here you go. The third reason is law enforcement challenges. Stadium policing in Italy has always been tricky. Ultras are highly organized, they operate basically like a paramilitary group with hierarchies, codes of silence, and networks across the country. The authorities often face difficulty infiltrating or prosecuting them without sparking violent retaliations. And historically, stadiums bans, so DASPO, that's how it's called in Italian, were easy to bypass. Fans could still coordinate outside or even travel under different names. Hasn't been really easy. The fourth reason is social tolerance. In Italy, football isn't just a game. As I was saying, it's an identity marker. Local, political, even class based. And that's why ultras groups are often romanticized as the heart of the curva, even when their actions are violent. So, yeah, not really romantic. But some people see them as defenders of tradition and working class pride, and it makes society a little more hesitant to root them out completely. There's a lot of people excusing them, essentially. And finally, the fifth is organized crime overlap. In cities like Naples, Rome, Milan, ultras overlap with mafia type groups, and authorities sometimes simply picked their battles. Cracking down on ultras could mean directly confronting powerful criminal syndicates, which required resources beyond the scope of football policing. So let's say we didn't really invest in much on that. But beyond all this, Calcio in Italy is also a big tool for political influence and corruption. Owning or backing a team has always been a way for politicians or even businessmen to gain votes, prestige, social capital, and power. Silvio Berlusconi is the clearest example. His control of Milan from the 90s massively boosted his popularity and helped pave his way to becoming a prime minister in a way. There have been cases of really countless scandals involving the most popular teams and the very top levels of Italian calcio. Here we're coming back to Juventus, the team that I was mentioning before, or Juve, as it's just more commonly called in Italy. Over the years, they've become the most decorated team in the country, as well as the undisputed most popular club in Italy. Juventus was founded back in 1897 here in Turin, and it's all but just a football club. Thanks to their historical ties with the Agnelli family, which is the same dynasty that owns Fiat and now Stellantis, of course, and in part Ferrari. They've always been connected to power, politics, and money. And of course, they've had their healthy dose of scandals as well. Most famously, Juventus was involved in the case of Calciopoli in 2006. And back then, investigators uncovered a system where top clubs, including Juventus, were pressuring referee designations to assign referees favorable to them, let's say. Juventus, again, the most powerful club in Italy, was found guilty, stripped of 2 league titles, and relegated to Serie B, the lower competition level, for the first time in history. The scandal shook Italy really at its core because it showed how deeply corruption was embedded in the game's very structure. But like in every comeback story, they climbed back up and went on to dominate the league again. 9 titles in a row from 2012 to 2020. And here's why I was saying before that Juve represents Calcio so well. It is polarizing, really. In Italy, you either love them or you absolutely hate them. Those are the most common scenarios. Their fan base is huge and nationwide, but rivals, especially from the south, like Napoli fans, Palermo fans, see them as a symbol of privilege of the establishment of the North as well. You may have noticed that I've said the word money a lot. So, as you may imagine at this point, in Italy, Calcio is also a huge money making machine. The numbers alone are staggering, and they help explain why so much power and sometimes so much darkness revolves around this sport. According to the same report that I was mentioning before from the Federazione Italiana Giuoco del Calcio, it makes me laugh, sorry guys, for the non-Italians listening, because it's called Giuoco instead of gioco, and Giuoco is like the old way of saying calcio. Sounds funny, okay? But every year, apparently, football draws over 21 million spectators in Italy, and the sport accounts for almost 80% of all attendance and spending in Italian sports combined. After COVID, ticket revenues have gone through the roof. The top 8 highest grossing matches in Italian football history all happened in the last few years. To give you one figure, the semi-final between Inter and Barcelona in the UEFA Champions League in May 2023 made nearly 15 million euros in ticket sales for a single game. The betting industry, even more mind blowing. In 2024, football betting in Italy reached 16.1 billion euros, almost 8 times more than in 2006. Globally, betting just on Serie A generates nearly 34 billion euros every year. And Italian clubs aren't just sport teams, they're really global media brands, basically. And collectively, they count around 300 million fans and followers across social media, with over 3 billion interactions and 3.3 billion YouTube views. That makes Serie A clubs basically some of the most powerful companies, in a way, in the Italian economy when it comes to the online reach, at least. In Italian culture, the most famous calcio players are usually our own version of Hollywood celebrities and divas. You know, we gossip about their girlfriends and they become models and they sponsor everything. And they have villas around the place. So they're a little bit our own celebrities. Cristiano Ronaldo is the perfect example of this, really, both in terms of general popularity within the fans as well as influence on the entire country. At least in the past decades, Cristiano Ronaldo is one of the most famous athletes in the world. He's Portuguese, and between 2018 and 2021, he played for Juventus, for example. If you've never heard of him, just picture one of the players with sponsors and ad deals all around the place all the time. He's moved to Italy back when he started his time at Juventus, which was such a big deal that there was something called Norma CR7 from his nickname. It was a flat tax advantage that was introduced in 2017, and it was aimed at attracting wealthy people to move their tax residence to Italy. And Ronaldo was among the first high profile beneficiaries. And here's how this works. Instead of paying regular taxes on your income from abroad, you pay like a fixed 100,000 euros per year amount, regardless of how much you actually earn. It's a pretty sweet deal, right? So, in honor of the humble Cristiano Ronaldo, they named the law after him. But Ronaldo wasn't, of course, the reason the law existed, or not officially, as far as we know. The rule applied to really anyone, and it was just a nickname. So it became sort of the symbol himself of that law. So when you put it all together, you can see why culture is not just a national sport, but the single largest cultural and economic engine of entertainment in Italy. But now you know that it's not all about cheering in the stadium, it's about control, influence, and business. And this is why I wanted to dedicate today's episode to it, because understanding Italian football also means understanding a little piece of Italy itself, its contradiction, its excesses, its deep cultural ties between society, politics, and culture. And as a disclaimer that again, I really do not hate culture of people that like culture. One of my favorite memories actually from my teenage years is from 2006, which is the year when Italy won the World Championship. And I have really super fun memories because it was probably one of the few times that I got to enjoy calcio in a very nice and enjoyable setting. It was, I remember, obviously, the more Italy was succeeding in the championship, the more people were getting passionate about it. And that night for the finals, I remember being in the main plaza of my hometown with a lot of other people, and it was so late, and there was that back then one and only night pub open at the time that was of course broadcasting the match because everyone wanted to watch that. And the joy when the team won, it was really authentic, it was really full of passion, it was really a magical night. And I'm telling you this just because I think it's a pity. I think it's really something that is part of our culture as Italians, Italians is really a wonderful part of our identity, but it's undeniably tied to a darker side of this country as well. And I would love to hear from you, of course. Send in your thoughts on Instagram, or even better, share a voice note because it might feature in a future episode. And for today's topic, I suggest watching the very recent comedy Ogni maledetto fantacalcio on Netflix. Even if Italian comedy isn't usually your thing, give it a try because it's more than laughs. Through the story of friends obsessed with fantasy football, it gives a surprisingly sharp window into Italian calcio culture, how it seeps into everyday life, and why it's never just a game here.